Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Barsanti. I'm the Edwin Wolf II Director of the Library Company of Philadelphia. And it is my pleasure again to welcome you to tonight's Fireside Chat. I'll say a word about our author, Thom Nickels, who'll be speaking tonight in a moment. But I wanted to, before going any farther, just thank you for coming and thank you for being a part of our learning community. And want to encourage you, now that you're here at this event, to go back to our events page on our website and our social media feed to stay on top of all the events that we have coming up. These fireside chats are meant to introduce our people in our community to the scholars who use our collections and to the other people in our community who are producing work. And Thom Nickels has been known in Philadelphia for many years for his writing and reporting, and we're really glad to have him here tonight talking about his latest book about religious cults in Philadelphia. Thom is the author of 15 books, including Philadelphia Architecture, Literary Philadelphia, and Philadelphia Mansions back in 2018. I believe, Phil, I think you've talked about Literary Philadelphia with us in the last year or so, last couple of years.
I did, Mike.
Nickels was nominated for a Lambda Literary Award for 2 novellas back in 1990 and awarded the 2005 Philadelphia AIA Lewis Mumford Award for Architectural Journalism. His 1980s column, Different Strokes in the Philadelphia Welcome Mat, was the first out gay column in a mainstream newspaper in the United States. His 2015 cover essay on Agnes Repplier was published by the American Catholic Studies Journal. He has written for the Philadelphia Inquirer, Passport Magazine, HuffPo, Icon Magazine, the New Oxford Review, PJ Media, Philadelphia Magazine, and the Broad Street Review, and currently writes for the Irish Edition, the Philadelphia Press, City Journal out of New York, the Philadelphia Weekly, the Delaware Valley Journal, and Broad and Liberty. And we are really glad to have him here again with us tonight. Thank you, Thom.
Thank you, Mike. So I should take it away now, Mike?
It is yours to take away. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the introduction. My book, From Mother Divine to the Corner Swami, Religious Cults in Philadelphia, I start out by explaining my use of the word cults. And of course, in the academic world, the word cult is really rarely used. Instead, we hear terms like new religious movement, but I think that's a cumbersome phrase, really. So I think that cult really satisfies in this case. So I would also define a cult as an organization of followers that disband or die out when their leader dies. Whereas in an established church, for instance, a new leader, pope, bishop, rabbi, what have you, is elected or appointed. Cults tend to harbor absolute authoritarianism. So forget about critical inquiry, as they say. A cult, you might say, also encourages unreasonable fears about the outside world. And financial records also are never revealed in hardcore cults, and followers who leave the cults are considered evil or in some instances tracked down and harassed, which was really the case in Scientology until very, very recently. I start the book off with my experiences with Mother Divine, and on March 14th, 2017, the New York Times announced her death, and they had a very, very curious headline at that time. The headline read, "Mother Divine, who took over her husband's cult, dies at 91." Now, this is really the first time that I had ever seen the word cult in reference to the peace mission movement. It was always said verbally, sort of on the street, as it were, but I had very rarely seen it in print. I was invited to meet Mother Divine with an artist friend of mine about 8 or 9 years ago. He's a painter, and he wanted to do a couple of watercolors of some of the interiors there. So he initiated the contact. And we were invited to their Holy Communion service, which is really their midday banquet. So we went and met Mother Divine. It was a very pleasant, unusual experience. The food is all homegrown, very incredible, multiple platters. The sexes are divided by sides of the table. As the platters are passed from the kitchen, you're supposed to take what you need and then not allow the platter to touch the table, but then pass it on to your seatmate. So this ritual is very elaborate, and it's kind of like a dance. During the dinner, I was amazed. It's a very, very mixed company of white and black. The white people tended to be older and generally foreign. And I noticed that they were generally from places like Denmark and Norway, and that they had been with the peace mission movement for a very, very long time. A disturbing element crept in, I think, when they started to play old sermons by Father Divine. And these were rickety, old, staticky sermons that had a ring of authenticity and old radio. But during these sermons, the level of devotion I saw in the eyes of the people around me was pretty high. And at a certain point, people started to clap and sing. They would just break out in song. And at that point, the entire situation appeared very, very cult-like to me. Other than the fact that when I entered the dinner with the camera, I was told by a very upset aide to Mother Divine that I was not permitted to take photographs. So a little bit about Mother Divine. She was born in Canada. Her name was Edna Rose Richings. At 15 years old, she found out about Father Divine, and she claims that she had some kind of an epiphany or a vision that Father Divine is God Almighty personified in a beautiful holy body. So as a very, very young woman, she made her way from Vancouver to the peace mission movement and literally talked her way into a job as one of Father Divine's secretaries. He had many secretaries, I think 13. So initially she was just one of many. Edna Richings appeared after the death of Father Divine's first wife. She was an African-American woman. She was not too well known in the media. She received very little PR spotlight. And people don't quite know why that was. But after her death, Edna Richings convinced Father Divine to marry her. The marriage was a celibate thing, as all members of the peace mission movement were pretty much like the Shakers. The sexes were separated and there was no intimacy in that regard at all. Although later in my research, I did discover that Father Divine did have multiple affairs, mainly with a number of his secretaries, and that Mother Divine herself also had a kind of a secret life. She preferred private massages in a room in the Woodmont estate. And I'm jumping ahead of the game by saying that these massages were, since all the doors of the peace mission movement were not allowed to be closed or locked, whenever anyone in the mansion walked in on these massages, they were then banished because they had seen what they should not have seen. So this didn't come out until years later. Of course, the people who followed Father Divine really believed that he was God. Father Divine had an adopted son from California, a man by the name of Tommy Garcia, who came to the mansion at 8 years old. He was molested on his second night at the mansion by the head of security. The head of security was then fired, but I think that marked Tommy Garcia forever. When Father Divine, though, his role in the civil rights movement often gets overlooked because of the cultish aspects of the peace mission movement, and this is unfortunate. As early as 1951, he advocated for reparations for the descendants of slaves, which is pretty remarkable when you consider the date of 1951, and for integrated neighborhoods. And decades before the Civil Rights Act, before the NAACP, before Stokely Carmichael and Angela Davis and the Black Panthers, he preached nonviolent social change. And he was very, very adamant about this. And he also taught his followers to look beyond race and not to identify as necessarily black or white, but to transcend that racial identity. And that was his goal, to make the entire society race blind. When Father Divine died, there were strange things that happened in the Woodmont mansion. Tommy Garcia, the adopted son, was required to stand at Mother Divine's side during the funeral ceremonies. And the entire assembly, all of the members of the peace mission movement, were forbidden to show any expressions of sorrow. And if anyone cried or got emotional, they were banished from the funeral. And so it was the adopted son's role at the funeral to keep an eye out for people who displayed any display of emotion. Because of course, if you believe that somebody was God, why cry? Because God lives forever. And so this was the philosophy under this. Also, when Mother Divine became the head CEO, as it were, of the peace mission movement, she fired a lot of people who were close to Father Divine. For obvious reasons, I think. The peace mission movement and the Woodmont mansion, especially, was rife with competing cliques who wanted to outdo one another in terms of power and prestige. And there was a lot of backstabbing in the old Machiavellian sense. Mother Divine, of course, was a trophy wife. I don't know if there was any true love there, but she was blonde and young, and she fit Father Divine's model of the perfect unity of the races, black and white, and her blonde hair certainly helped that look. Mother Divine's life as a widow was marked by many public appearances. She often appeared in the society pages of the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Bulletin. She would show up in fine furs and jewelry, and she lived the high life for a while. But later that all changed because she became a prisoner of the palace. She once complained to her adopted son that they keep her locked up in her room. And basically, she developed a case of a dementia, which I think I saw the first inklings of during my visit. After the visit, we left in a taxi cab, and it was the custom of the Woodmont mansion people then to take Mother Divine out for a walk. And she was surrounded by 10 or so women in red coats and berets. And it was very, very easy to see that this woman was not happy, that she was basically under their control. So this I think was a very sad thing. Two more things about the peace mission movement that I found really, really interesting was the fact that Jim Jones of Jonestown fame, Jonestown infamy, I should say, visited the Woodmont mansion, and he brought about 200 of his followers from California in school buses to Gladwin, Pennsylvania, where they stayed for 2 or 3 days. And initially, Mother Divine was very kind to them, but when Jim Jones started to preach that Father Divine had conferred his mantle on him as Father Divine's successor, that's when Mother Divine knew that Jones was trying to take over the movement, and she ordered them all off of her property. Now, after Mother Divine's death, the estate is in intense litigation. The adopted son and his wife, who I believe live in Las Vegas, are struggling with a small power struggle in Woodmont, who basically have taken over Woodmont. So it's as yet unresolved. I cover also in my book a man named Melvin Floyd, and perhaps some of the audience would remember him. In the mid-1970s, it was a traumatic time for gay rights organizations in Philadelphia. The Reverend Melvin Floyd was a former police officer who had established something called the Neighborhood Crusades with offices on Queen Lane in Germantown. I used to live in Queen Lane in Germantown, right down the street from Melvin Floyd's offices. So I often saw his infamous Volkswagen van, I think it was, and it had a dummy on the top, kind of emerging out of a coffin, which was supposed to represent the deadly attraction of drugs. Now, at the time, Melvin Floyd, I was completely blinded by his hateful view on gay rights, and he did give ugly testimony at Philadelphia City Council on the pending gay civil rights bills then. In fact, people at that time, there was a petition table outside of City Hall Annex, and there were people with megaphones who were gleefully shouting to passersby that homosexuals had rotten teeth. Now, this was a new one to me, because I don't know what science fiction novel this was read from, but it just seemed extraordinary. Later on, though, regarding Melvin Floyd, I did discover that he did a lot of good work in the Black community. He did fight against street crime, against absentee fathers, and drug dealing. And he actually gave a talk on Broad Street in 1977, was awarded an award from the Philadelphia Bar Association. And I guess I learned to appreciate this man, although at the time, his whole following I considered to be a cult. Now, in the 1970s in Philadelphia, LSD became the new high wire party drug. I go into a lot of the organizations in University City, especially at Powhatan Village, which in a fun sense was its own version of a cult. That's where Ira Einhorn lived, and a lot of the activist leaders. That's where Move eventually emerged from before they moved to another section of Philadelphia. Now, Powhatan, as I said, was really Philadelphia's Bohemia, and it tended to house outcasts and fringe characters, mavericks and counterculture people, and a number of raging lunatics, to be frank, who were just plain poor. Ira Einhorn, of course, was, had large groups of people visit him before his eventual downfall. They would sit in a semicircle around his elevated position on a window seat while he expounded on LSD and Marshall McLuhan. I never met Einhorn, but I did know a friend of Holly Maddox, who told me stories about how Holly Maddox would come to her and ask her how she could get away from Ira, because she felt that something bad was going to happen down the road. Of course, Ira Einhorn had tremendous charisma. He attracted corporate CEOs and heads who would come and pay to sort of hear him speak on the coming new age and its impact on technology. Or, of course, they would take him to expensive lunches at La Terrace in University City. Ira Einhorn, oddly enough, after a lifetime of in the public eye, as it were, as a major public figure, died alone in a prison cell in Western Pennsylvania. And his death occurred at the beginning of COVID. And it was really like a page 3 item in the Inquirer. I do talk about Move in the book. And Move, of course, was a kind of a cult. It was in Palatine Village from the late 1970s until 1986. I'm sorry, the bombing occurred in 1986, and it was no longer in Palatine Village at that time. In the beginning years, Move was not popular among their African American neighbors. Everybody complained about them. I don't know whether there was a lot of shouting from bullhorns and shrieks and the shouting of obscenities. And of course, word clarity was not always a component of these presentations. So everything came across as gibberish turned to static, which really was a very major form of noise pollution. Now, while Move claimed to be revolutionary, it was out of step, ironically enough, with most of the popular political movements of the time, such as the gay rights movement, which had an important ally at the University of Pennsylvania. There was at the University of Pennsylvania at that time, the Gays at Penn lecture series, which was very, very popular and which hosted famous speakers from all over the country. It was a popular event, and it was very, very crowded, and several of these lectures were raided by Move members who stormed the stage while chanting obscenities about homosexuals, and these were not very, very nice things. In effect, these raids on the lecture series, in effect, shut down the lecture series. I believe 2 or 3 speeches had to be shut down totally because of these raids. But, you know, Move was against people like the Reverend Jesse Jackson, the Quakers, and the Communist Party. So they were really an unhinged ideological hodgepodge, which made them really hard to figure out. One of the more interesting groups that I looked into and that I do write about, excuse me, is Hare Krishna. And of course, Hare Krishna in the 1970s, especially in the late 60s, provided a spiritual niche for many seekers. You might say that it was, you know, because it was Eastern and exotic, and it meant shaving your head and wearing a small ponytail, donning an orange saffron robe, painting a stripe or 2 on your face. But it really meant separating yourself from a material-based culture and giving up much of your individual identity for the sake of the collective. And in many ways, it was the perfect spiritual home for the disaffected hippie. The Krishna temple in Mount Airy was also a far more refined and transcendental space than those free love-based hippie communes whose only code of ethics really seemed to be the whole earth catalog and to love the one you're with. Ironically, and this I found really extraordinary, even when I used to go for free vegetarian meals at the Mount Airy temple. Everybody went there, by the way. It was the thing to do on a quiet, boring Sunday. You got great vegetarian food and you listened to drum beats and chants, and you saw amazing dolled up images in jewels and glittering robes. But I was amazed then, as I still am now, that the Krishna moral code, the rules and regulations governing how individual devotees should behave, were as orthodox as the rules in the most strict Christian monastic communities. Krishna devotees, for instance, were expected to be celibate, if not married, and sexual outlets like masturbation and homosexuality were extremely forbidden. A Krishna marriage was also expected to last a lifetime. The idea was to produce children rather than design a cozy birth control plan. So even birth control was outlawed and divorce was not permitted. So, you know, I suppose that this is why for many young men and women in the 60s and 70s, Krishna temples were really rites of passage. And it made sense in those hippie countercultural days for a smart young man intent on bucking the status quo to do a stint in a Vermont hippie commune, work a month or two with the Socialist Worker Party, and then take a month-long Ken Kesey style road trip and then do 5 months as a Krishna temple. But Krishna monks were never monks for long. By and large, it would be 5 to 10 months, 2 years at tops, and then the devotees were out of there and onto something else. But I did see in those days the emergence of Hare Krishna as a barometer of things to come. And I would often ask myself, in an era of total personal freedom, why were some young people at the height of their youth and beauty turning to self-denial? Scientology was also very, very fascinating to me. And of course, the Scientology headquarters, I believe, is at 1212 Ray Street. Scientology was started by Lafayette Ronald Hubbard, who died in 1986. And Hubbard was a science fiction writer who once said, "You don't get rich writing science fiction. If you want to get rich, start a religion." So that's exactly what he did. Although he wrote his first book, Dianetics, which later became a bestseller. And I think to date, there are 20 million copies of his book, Dianetics, in print. Scientology basically talks about the state of the clear. And the state of the clear is a rather ambiguous term that that states that it's a state that few humans have ever obtained since the beginning of the planet. So then one has to wonder, well, if the state of the clear is a viable option in Scientology, how does one attain it if so few people have ever attained it? But if you're a clear or a semi-clear in Scientology, you're basically free from potential psychosomatic illnesses, and you have gotten rid of all repressed emotions that are basically holding you back from developing fully as a human person. I had a bit of an experience with Scientology at 19 when a friend of mine in Colorado brought me to a e-meter reader in Las Vegas who attached a e-meter to my wrist, which is basically, it basically looks like a lie detector with Velcro. And through a series of questions that she would ask you, she's able to gauge vis-a-vis a needle on her end, where on the emotional scale you fail or pass. This is a very generalized definition of an e-meter, but the experience to me proved nothing. It didn't change my life in any way, and it seemed more gizmo theater than anything else. A lot of Scientology is based on the teachings of Aleister Crowley, who was a famous occultist. And of course, you know, Aleister Crowley's famous saying is, do as thy wilt, this is the whole of the law. Crowley, of course, was the author of many books. He also happened to be addicted to heroin and cocaine, but he influenced L. Ron Hubbard, as well as L. Ron Hubbard's son, L. Ron Hubbard Jr., who moved the headquarters of Scientology to, of all places, Camden, New Jersey. And for a brief time, Scientology was at 5th and Market Streets in Camden, New Jersey. And at that time, Father Hubbard in 1953 gave lectures both in Camden and in Philadelphia. So they eventually left Camden, I think in 1955. Now, currently, Scientology has 2 properties in the city. The most famous one, I think, is the property they bought. It was the headquarters of the Cunningham Piano Company, and another building at 13th and Chestnut. Now, what the status of these purchases are now, nobody seems to know. Certainly, the buildings have not been activated as Scientology adjacent headquarters to the Ray Street building. So as far as I know, they are just lying dormant. But an interesting protest occurred in 2008 when 200 protesters from the group Anonymous, that's a group that has kind of fallen into obscurity, but it was quite active in 2008, 2009, and 2010. But they protested in the street against Scientology's abuse of members and ex-members. And it was a real problem because Scientology would actually track down ex-members and do more than just harass them. In my book, I cover a lot of fun things like the cult of the pit bull, which has really become a kind of a club. Around certain people, you can't say anything against the breed, or it's like major ideological warfare. It's amazing. So that was a fun addition. Another person, the life of South Street and the preponderance of psychics and gurus in the 1970s and early 80s, especially with the advent of a magazine that was very popular then, which was called New Frontier magazine. This was a very interesting time in the city's history. There were always ads for visiting yogas or Indian god women, as they call them. Now these so-called god women usually made appearances at the Unitarian Church at 21st and Chestnut Street. The editor and founder of New Frontier magazine was a man named Swami Nostradamus Verato, formerly Joseph Banks, but also known as Slimy Tomato. He still has quite a reputation in the city. And he was born into a Lithuanian family in Brooklyn in 1938. He was a smart Jewish kid with an introspective and scholastic bent. He first realized that he was able to tap into mystical realms was at the age of 9. He had somehow, and for some reason, walked into a Catholic church in Brooklyn and started to pray. And at the time, he said that he saw Jesus Christ come to him in spiritual, physical form. So the little Swami never forgot this. After completing college, the future Swami entered the corporate world, married, and had 3 children. And his biography also states that he was even a member of the local junior chamber of commerce. Now, this is all pretty solid citizen stuff. And it certainly had the markings of a future city council member, for instance. But then something happened. Banks says that he was out walking with his family in 1972 and adopted the life of a cosmic drifter. And so as an official vagabond in search of truth, in 1976, as I said, he was struck by, he says, 2 flashes of light from above while walking in New York City. Now, this experience allowed him to enter into what he calls a fulfilled state of consciousness, where his intuitive abilities and his attitude towards life changed. The experience caused him to leave the corporate world in 1979, after which he traveled to India, where he studied meditation and Eastern philosophy. A year later, he was initiated by the famous guru Osho, that's O-S-H-O. He also left his family and his children. So this experience caused him to change his life completely. Virato lived on South Street before his departure to Asheville, North Carolina in 1994. His work in Asheville included the management of a holistic detoxification and meditation retreat. He left Philadelphia at the time because he felt that Philadelphia was becoming overly crowded and that the region in general was falling victim to dangerous sprawl. I wonder what he would think if he could see it now. And now, while he seemed to find some peace and comfort in Asheville, he once complained that he had a car stolen 1 block away in Asheville from the public access television station where he worked as a producer. He was also afraid that Asheville, now that it had been discovered as a rustic, mountain, sophisticated hideaway, would in time be ruined by its own popularity, as most hideaway Mecca places are. In 2007, he complained that you can't even walk the streets of Philadelphia or New York because of crack smokers and people smoking marijuana in the street. He hated the smell of marijuana and he hated people smoking marijuana in the street. So he would probably not be happy with today's city, where you cannot go anywhere without smelling the smell. Virato died on February 2nd, 2013, in a hospice in Asheville with his wife by his side. In one photograph, he is shown lying in repose with a feather in his hand. The picture is in my book, with a happy expression on his face. And he, another thing that he said, which was very disturbing, he, at the time of AIDS, he had said that he had hoped that AIDS would kill as many people as possible because he felt that the world was becoming overpopulated and that it needed plagues and things of that nature to lower the population. I also did a small section on Philly Jesus. And I did this only because, Philly Jesus started as a complete PR marketing scam, and it worked because it got the attention of the media. Ex-heroin addict dons a white robe and a full-fledged cross and preaches Jesus style to the homeless and to anyone who would listen. But later, at an event before COVID in City Hall Courtyard, I believe it was the anniversary Whitman event. And Philly Jesus was in amongst the crowd, but he was also in a corner. And people were coming up to him for serious consultations, and they tended to be 14 and 15-year-olds. And these were obviously boys who really thought that he had a special message. And obviously, Philly Jesus's garb and his PR gimmick worked to fool the very young. I also, in the book, I talk about the Church of the Process, which used to be a viable presence in the city, especially in Center City and Suburban Station. The Church of the Process was a polite way of saying the Church of Satan. And these were people, these were really missionaries in long black opera capes who handed out leaflets to commuters and who vied for attention with the Jehovah's Witnesses, who stood with their medal stands and their watchtower booklets. They would just cruise through Suburban Station, give people a leaflet, and of course, people didn't know who they were, took the leaflet, and I'm sure once they read it, they were scandalized. The Church of the Process is now called something else. I believe it's an animal shelter group somewhere in California. So it's very bizarre how this group kind of organically morphed into what they are today. Of course, the 1970s saw a lot of proselytizing groups in Suburban Station. There was an Anglo-Catholic nun in full traditional habit who would sit in a chair by a column in the commuter area and beg for money. There was also Hare Krishna, and Jews for Jesus also made their way in there.
Thom, I'm sorry to interrupt,
Yes,
but
Mike.
this might be a good time to transition.
Absolutely.
To transition into questions, if
Great.
we might.
That's good. All right.
I'm sorry to just like come in there.
No, perfect time, because I was then reaching for the book.
Good.
The script had like literally run out, so yeah.
Good. So I'm going to encourage folks who have questions to use the Q&A feature, which you'll find somewhere down here on your Zoom screen. But Thom, I'm going to ask you the obvious question first, which is, so this is a book about these kinds of, religious cults in Philadelphia. In your research and in your thinking about it, did you find that there was something particular about Philadelphia that makes it conducive to these kinds of movements? Or were you able to see something that helped you to see Philadelphia in contrast with other cities at the same times that had more or less of this behavior? Like, is there something special about Philadelphia in this regard that you found in doing your research?
That's a good question. Having lived in Boston for a while, I do see some similarities between the two cities. Both cities, I think, are cities of enclaves and special interest groups. And what I can't call them cliques, but they're like communities and sub-communities of different people with similar interests. And I find that especially strong here. And I noticed that also when I lived in Germantown. It was especially evident. And Center City also, they tend to be mostly hidden. For instance, I was involved briefly with a Buddhist group that used to chant that famous, I don't remember, but I'm sure anyone can probably say it. But I think that the city it's always been quirky and funky and unpredictable. So I think that there's something in the DNA here which lends itself to that, yes.
Yeah.
Going back to George Lepard and his crazy antics when he wrote his books.
Yeah, you can go back even farther to, the hermit of the Wissahickon, or to
Hermit of Wissahickon.
Well, I mean, and I suppose one could make the argument that, this was a city that was founded in contrast to Boston, and embraced religious tolerance to a greater degree, and a wider scope of religions were welcomed here. Maybe you can trace the lineage even far, all the way back to William Penn. I don't know. But it is, there was a comment. I think we're probably going to have a lot of these. I have one of my own I'm saving for you, but a comment came in from David Latovsky, who said that in the 70s, there was a storefront church of Black Jews. It was a small street off of 22nd and Ridge. And so I don't know if that's something that you would have come across, the Black Jews at 22nd and Ridge, but
I did not come across that. That sounds extremely fascinating. I'm sorry, I did not come across it. What I did come across is the group of so-called Hebrew Israelites, of course, that have been preaching on streets here since time immemorial. Not always nice sermons, generally very, very aggressive and eye and ear catching. But I haven't seen them in a while, as a matter of fact. But that's what that reminds me of, although the group that the listener mentioned sounds much more reasonable and civilized.
The Black Hebrew Israelites had a moment of national visibility during, I think it was, I don't know if it was during a Trump rally or something, where there was someone who was accosted, or there was a fight that was going on involving a young Trump supporter. I just remember that was in the national news, and I
remember that.
I think people remember seeing them regularly outside of the suburban station, or outside at right across from City Hall at the
Reading Terminal,
City Hall entrance to Suburban.
Yes, and I always found them theatrically obtrusive, but basically benign, because I used to walk right in front of them when they would say mean things about blonde-haired, blue-eyed people, which I was. And to be frank, I thought, should I continue my path in front of them? And I said yes, because this is all a bluster. It's all theater, and it's all a bluster. So I always found them to be okay and not a threat.
Yeah. I was going to ask if you meant, when I was at Penn in the late 90s, students on Locust Walk would often be greeted by Kathy Change.
Oh, yes.
Kathy Chang, who unfortunately killed herself in the late 90s. I guess it's not really fair to think of her in association with cults, but she was certainly part of the Philadelphia environment of individuals and unusual folks you would see even in the 90s around here.
Yes, I do tap into her a bit in the book's introduction, but I could not get a lot of information on Kathy Change, and that was sad. I mean, the whole idea of a suicide because you can't change the world seems to me pretty sad.
It's tragic.
Yeah.
Thom, I said I was going to mention it, and I forgot to mention it when I was introducing you, but I hope better late than never. You were telling me before we got started that you just signed a book contract to do a book on the Center City Jogger murders in the mid-90s.
Yes, I did. I was an instrumental part of that investigation. I lived at 21st and Pine. The body of the jogger, Kimberly Ernest, was found in a stairwell to a law firm right across the street. I knew a lot of the principal characters, and as a journalist, I was drawn into the investigation, both because I heard something in the wee hours of November 2nd, which kind of woke me up out of a sound sleep. And it was a loud noise and a scream, and then it ended. I went back to bed because I thought it was a bunch of drunken Penn students. Later, of course, I was able to piece the things together, but I will be doing the story of the Center City jogger. Yes. And of course, that was, that was a very, very scary time, because about a year and a half after the defendants, Richard Wise and Richard Hack, were kind of let go because of the lack of the DNA evidence, and because they accused the police of beating a confession out of them. Of course, in like 1995, there were sketchy things surrounding the police, to be truthful. So this was not that far-fetched. But in their case, there was no beating a confession out of them. Later, a private detective brought in an alleged assailant who was the son of a prominent Center City lawyer. He was also a known drug dealer at 17th and Pine. And so this whole murder includes Philadelphia's underworld. It includes people who used to go to the gay bars at Woody's and Westbury, people involved in the drug underworld, as well as the whole hustler scene at 17th and Pine, which of course is now completely gone. So it's a whole subculture that's completely disappeared, except for the drug culture, of course.
We have a question that's come in from an anonymous attendee who asks about where you started this talk tonight with Mother Divine and the Peace Mission movement. How did you go about gathering your information for the book? Did you have interviews with Peace Mission members, banquets? You described going to a banquet. I know the Peace Mission to be very private, so I'm interested in hearing how that may have hindered your information gathering.
Good question. Mother Divine was very, very gracious when I visited her with artist Noel Miles. She invited us into her office, which was formerly Father Divine's office. The office, I must say, was an exact replica of JFK's office before his assassination. So it was kind of eerie if you remembered those Life magazine photographs. She gave me a short interview then, and she was very generous. She just gave me book after book after book. So I came home with a pile of books that I could use as firsthand reference. Later, when I published various pieces on that visit with the Huff Post and the Spirit newspaper, I was contacted by the wife of the adopted son of Mother Divine, and Lori and Tommy Garcia, and I had a series of phone interviews with them on Tommy's experiences with Father Divine and Mother Divine and what they knew of the Peace Mission movement. So these interviews were really extremely valuable in getting what really happened behind closed doors.
There's a follow-up question, I think, from the same anonymous attendee who asks whether you consulted with the late Dr. Primiano, who was a friend and researcher of the Peace Mission movement.
I did not, but Lori Garcia mentioned his name a lot. Yes, but I did not.
Well, Thom, we are, oh, there's another question that came in. I was going to say David Latovsky mentions that he used to eat dinners at the Divine Hotel at 36th and Chestnut Street. There was always a place set for both father and mother. She would appear in the restaurant at times. For July 4th, they had a huge party with costumes. That was
Yes.
staying at the Divine Hotel was, often, visiting scholars or other folks would, I know a number of people who would say there was always the cheap and safe place to stay, back in the 90s, and I'm sure long before that.
Yes, and certainly when I went to the so-called Holy Communion banquet or dinner at Woodmont, there was a place set for Father Divine. It was an empty chair. There was a place setting, no food, of course. So I am familiar with that. I'm also familiar with the Divine Lorraine Hotel as the so-called dumping off ground, when an emissary from the Peace Mission movement came from LA with Tommy Garcia after his picture was approved and after a deal was made with Tommy Garcia's mother, that she would then hand him over and his sister to Father and Mother Divine, because they, of course, could not have children. So they were then, after this long series of negotiations, they were transported by car across the country and left at the Divine Lorraine Hotel, deposited in separate rooms, not knowing what was going on. Both of the children were pretty much terrified. And only the next day did they realize that they were being farmed out to Woodmont, where Tommy Garcia eventually met Father Divine and was introduced to him as his potential adopted son if he would consent. His sister was not permitted to live in Woodmont, I guess because of her gender. She was sent to the women's house or to the young girls' house. So it's a very, very sad story, because brother and sister hardly ever saw each other after that. It gets sadder and sadder.
Well, Thom, we have come to the end of our hour. Thank you again for spending this time with us and for talking about your book. I, again, thank all of you who've been with us tonight, who've stayed and listened to the talk and brought forward a lot of great questions. And I look forward to seeing all of you again at our next event. And again, consult our events page on the website. I won't give you the full litany now, but again, thank you for joining us. Have a great night. And Thom, thank you for your time, and thank you for your research and your presentation.
Thank you, Mike.
Good night to everyone.
It was very nice. Thank you.
Thanks.